In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The New South Wales COVID outbreak is worsening and borders are closing around the country as we head into school holidays. The Prime Minister says it's not a race, but the New South Wales Premier said today there is a real sense of urgency, and until the vast majority of our population is vaccinated, these threats will be real. How many outbreaks will it take before the government fixes the bungled vaccine rollout and creates a safe national quarantine system?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I spoke to the Premier earlier today and we spoke specifically about if there was any need for further vaccine doses to be distributed in New South Wales, and the Premier advised me that she was pleased with the dosage distribution based on
Members
population.
on my left.
That was her clear advice to me today, and that was advised to her on National Cabinet by Lieutenant General FLYNN earlier in the week. I commend the New South Wales Premier for the way that she is handling the outbreak in New South Wales, the fact that she hasn't gone to lock down Australia's biggest city, but she has taken, I think, the very positive decision to keep Sydney open and to keep New South Wales open for its residents, Mr Speaker, and to continue to rely on what is Australia's best contact tracing system in New South Wales. Mr Speaker, I can advise that even as of today, two-thirds, just at 66.27, just under two-thirds of our population over the age of 70 has now been vaccinated. 49.1% on those first doses of those over 50 and 27.4% for those aged over 16. In the last 24 hours, some 140,819 doses have been administered. We are now at 6.86 million doses having been administered in Australia. Now, Mr Speaker, it might suit the politics of the Leader of the Opposition to run down Australia's performance. It may suit the politics of the Leader of the Opposition to undermine Australia's efforts as we lead the world when it comes to managing COVID in this country, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will pause for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The question went to the
on
relevance. The question went to the Prime Minister's responsibility. Responsibility.
The Leader of the Opposition will cease debating points of order. I made that point yesterday, and I'm going to say, in response to the question, it was a very long series of questions with a series of claims, and the Prime Minister is in order. And I've been listening to him carefully. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition needs to understand that carping negativity is not a substitute for policy positions, Mr Speaker. The Opposition has been invited for more than a year to join the government in our efforts to combat the virus. But throughout the pandemic, they have chosen time and again, Mr Speaker, to pursue political point scoring rather than joining and supporting the national effort. Now, 95% of Australians, Mr Speaker, we saw in the Lowy poll today, believe that Australia has handled this pandemic well. And the evidence, when you look at the case numbers in Australia, the fatality rate in Australia, which could have been 30,000 more were it not for the steps taken by governments, including our government, Mr Speaker, to ensure that Australia has positioned itself as one of the best countries in the world as we move through this pandemic. The Opposition seems to believe that when there is a global pandemic, there can't be transmission of a virus. That is a foolish position and a misleading position, Mr Speaker. We've taken a realistic approach, working with governments around the country to keep Australians safe, to protect lives and protect livelihoods. The Opposition continues to focus on politics and point scoring, Mr Speaker, rather than just supporting a national effort. And I commend Lieutenant General FLYNN for the great job he's doing in ensuring that we're moving as quickly as we can to vaccinate as many people as we can.
The member for MONCRIEFF.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government is working to secure Australia's economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in our energy and resources sector? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for MONCRIEFF for her question. Australia has been one of the standout nations in the world, and not only just in terms of how we've protected the lives of Australians, but also their livelihoods. We're one of just 2 countries that recently attended the G7 Plus together with South Korea that could say our economy was bigger after going through this pandemic, Mr Speaker, than it was before. And of course in Australia there are more people employed today at this point than there were before the pandemic started. And this has been recognised by Australians. The Lowy poll today shows that 79% of Australians are now optimistic or very optimistic about Australia's economic performance. And that has been as a result of the government working to get the balance right to ensure how we were managing both the health impacts of the pandemic, but ensuring that we also ensured that we had a growing economy. Now, we can't take that for granted, and that's why this year's budget was our plan to ensure we secured Australia's economic recovery. And there are many elements to that plan. The lower taxes, the infrastructure spending, the investment in skills, Mr Speaker, in our manufacturing sectors. But importantly, it was also about cutting red tape so businesses could get on and invest, particularly in major projects, and to ensure that we have affordable, reliable, lower emissions energy to power particularly our heavy industries in the new energy economy of the future. Now, it is incredibly disappointing, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party in the Parliament is opposing our efforts to make it easier for major investments in resource projects, particularly in states like Western Australia, by opposing our changes to the EPBC Act. Even the Labor Premier of Western Australia and all Labor premiers in this country are calling on the Labor opposition to support this bill to ensure we can improve investment. But they stand there stubbornly on the basis of ideology. But it doesn't end there. Their opposition last night to vote against lower emissions technologies like carbon capture and storage, Mr Speaker, goes completely against the efforts that this country is making to ensure that we move towards lower emissions technologies in the future. The member for Hunter has described the Labor Party's position as ideological madness, Mr Speaker, and that is exactly what it is. This is a Labor Party obsessed with carping negativity, opposing the government's efforts to keep our economy strong through the pandemic. What we've been able to achieve, Mr Speaker, as a country has not been with the support of the opposition. Their approach has just been negativity and ideology. That is not going to get us to a low emissions future. It's not going to get resource projects being approved in our states and territories and at a Commonwealth level. Labor Party needs to saddle up, Mr Speaker, with the economic improvements that we're seeking to put in place to bring Australia out of the COVID-19 pandemic strongly. Instead, what we're getting negativity, Mr Speaker, and opposition.
Time has concluded. The member for Whitlam, the member for Isaacs, others, I think you know what's going to happen if you keep interjecting. Can I also point out it's particularly pointless to interject at a television screen. The Leader of the Opposition.
Or dark, Mr Speaker. Well, sky before dark.
I don't know. Maybe they do it at home, but
they
no need
do,
to do it
Mr
here.
Speaker. They
the
do.
Leader of the Opposition has the
I
floor.
do too, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Premiers and Chief Ministers around the country have done the heavy lifting fighting the COVID virus. Labor and Liberal Premiers are giving the Prime Minister clear warnings about the urgency of the vaccine rollout, which stands at 3%, and the need for a safe national system of quarantine. What will it take for this Prime Minister to fix his bungled vaccine rollout and establish a safe national system of quarantine?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government has had 2 clear jobs through this pandemic. The first of those is to save
Members on my
lives.
left. Members on my
And
left.
the second is to save livelihoods. Mr Speaker, our job has been to save lives and to save livelihoods. And we know that were it not for the actions of the government working together with governments around this country, if our experience is compared to those of like countries around the world, more than 30,000 Australians would have perished during this crisis. That didn't occur because of the actions taken on our watch. And in addition to that, Mr Speaker, we have saved livelihoods to ensure that Australia's economy is stronger today than before the pandemic hit. And in addition to that, there are more Australians employed today than before the pandemic hit. Now, there have been many measures we've put in place to secure that, but those have included an investment of more than $310 billion in health initiatives as well as economic supports to achieve those results. Now, Mr Speaker, reference is made to the actions of the states, and I commend the actions of the states. In fact, Mr Speaker, as Prime Minister, I called the states together into the National Cabinet to ensure that our actions were coordinated. And one of the first actions we took, Mr Speaker, as a National Cabinet was to agree to put in place a system of hotel quarantine around this country that has been a key measure in ensuring that Australia has been able to have the success that it has. Breaches from any form of quarantine, Mr Speaker, in a global pandemic are inevitable, and that is why the further rings of containment with contact tracing, social distancing and other measures are vital. And of course the vaccination program, which I already have indicated, has now reached some 6.86 million people, and 2/3 almost of Australians aged over 70 in the most vulnerable populations having already received their first dose, and more than a quarter of Australians aged over 16 having received their first dose. And as the vaccination program continues to escalate, as we move from the AstraZeneca vaccine to the Pfizer vaccines, which were timed for their delivery because of international supply constraints in the second half of the year, that will continue to roll out, Mr Speaker. We've also invested $500 million in the quarantine facilities in the Northern Territory, which was recommended by the Holton Review. In addition to that, are partnering with states, in particularly Victoria right now, on the development of additional facilities to supplement the hotel quarantine program, not to replace it. So, Mr Speaker, the actions that our government has taken have saved lives and have saved livelihoods. That has been our focus. The politics in this has been left to the opposition, who have sought only to undermine and engage in carping negativity rather than engaging in the national project which this government has led to the great advantage of Australians.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the Morrison-Joyce government plans to strengthen regional Australia and create jobs? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of alternative approaches on regional Australia?
Good question.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the floor.
Well, thank you very much to the member of Flynn, and obviously the member of Flynn and the powerhouse in the mining industry and the coal industry, where so many jobs are, and we're unashamed to stand behind those coal miners, unlike the people on the other side. The member for Flynn knows about the work we're doing on the Bruce Highway, as does the member for Wide Bay, and how important that is. And we might also know the member for Flynn and the member for Capricornia would know about the work that we are doing on Rookwood Weir, and the thousands of jobs that will be provided by that. Might acknowledge the member for Capricornia and the hard work that she has done, being a person, a lady who brings jobs to her area and supports her area. Now, jobs are very important. We see that in the Inland Rail. We see it because their side understands clearly how agriculture and mining exports puts product on the boat that brings the cash in, so we can buy the gear, buy the standard of living that you experience. It's so vitally important that we keep reminding the Labor Party, who once upon a time represented labourers, but that's a long time in the past. That's a long time in the past. How important it is that they actually authentically go out and stand behind the coal miners of the Hunter Valley. And I know the member for Shortland has got to do a lot of work in that space of getting out and actually representing the coal miners, and maybe taking a bit of a lead from the gentleman who sits up behind him. But you also asked about alternate policies. I was a bit perplexed lately, because the other day we were trying to get through on the ARENA fund that supports renewable energy an extension, more money into it. And guess who knocked it down?
What you do,
There you go. Guess who knocked it down? But there are people who've read the Book of Revelations, and they reside up the back there, and I want to go through a couple of their quotes. The Senate has just voted down, this is the member for McMahon, the ARENA-led commitment to renewable energy. The NLP keeps on attacking ARENA. And Joel Fitzgibbon, the member for Hunter, said, "I call a spade, and my colleagues won't thank me." No, they won't thank me. But this isn't very clever. You're not very clever, you see. This isn't very clever, and I'm sure we're supposed to win. We're supposed to win. But the best
Members
one
on my
is the
left.
member for Grainler. But we won't agree to the renewable energy agencies like ARENA and the Clean Energy Fund and supporting things like hydrogen, which actually your ALP policy platform says you do support. But it was all right because we had the member for Hunter saying the government was proposing to put more money into something they're already doing. We're already doing. So the Labor Party is all at sea on jobs, and maybe the Labor Party
The
is
Deputy
two
Prime
parties.
Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House, 1, notes A, there is a global pandemic. B, there have been at least 25 COVID outbreaks from hotel quarantine. C, fewer than 3% of Australians are fully vaccinated. D, the Prime Minister had 2 jobs this year: to roll out the vaccine and establish a safe national system of quarantine, and he has bungled both jobs. E, the outbreak in Sydney is worsening by the hour. F, new restrictions are being imposed on businesses and households. G, borders are slamming shut as Australia heads into school holidays. H, the Prime Minister says the vaccine rollout is not a race. And I, the New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, said today, New South Wales has had a real sense of urgency in relation to the vaccine rollout. Until the vast majority of our population is vaccinated, these threats will be real and ongoing. And 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to urgently fix his bungled vaccine rollout and establish a safe national system of quarantine.
Is leave granted?
Leave is not granted.
The Leader of the Opposition.
I move that so much as standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition moving the following motion immediately. That the House, 1, notes A, there is a global pandemic. B, there have been at least 25 COVID outbreaks from hotel quarantine. C, fewer than 3% of Australians are fully vaccinated. D, the Prime Minister had 2 jobs this year: to roll out the vaccine and establish a safe national system of quarantine, and he has bungled both jobs. E, the outbreak in Sydney is worsening by the hour. F, new restrictions are being imposed on businesses and households. G, borders are slamming shut as Australia heads into school holidays. H, the Prime Minister says the vaccine rollout is not a race. And I, the New South Wales Premier, said today New South Wales has had a real sense of urgency in relation to the vaccine rollout. Until the vast majority of our population is vaccinated, these threats will be real and ongoing. And 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to urgently fix his bungled vaccine rollout and establish a safe national system of quarantine. Mr Speaker, we needed more jabbings and less stabbings. But what we've
Leader
got
of the
from this
Opposition will
government
resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
Leader of the House has moved the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair and the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Nichols and Gray, tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa, tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The Manager of Opposition Business.
Seconded. People are at risk because of their incompetence, and they're afraid to debate it. They're afraid to have the debate here on the floor of the Parliament.
Will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
I move the member be no longer heard.
The question is the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or didn't vote in the last division, in which case they need to tell the tellers. Well, lock the doors. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. And then I'll say lock the doors. Lock the doors now. Appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Again, members must remain in their seat unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The member for Ryan.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please remind the House of the Morrison government's ongoing success in securing our economic recovery to ensure that Australian families can benefit from extra jobs and lower taxes, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan, acknowledge his experience, Mr. Speaker, as a councillor in the Brisbane City Council, the largest council across Australia, where he performed a very important role, Mr. Speaker, as the Treasurer, of the Brisbane City Council. And he understands, like we understand on this side of the House, that Australia has been hit by the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression with COVID-19. And the Morrison government made a commitment of $291 billion, Mr. Speaker. That is more than twice what all the states and territories have committed combined. And the result has been the creation of nearly 1 million new jobs since May last year. The unemployment rate fell to 5.1%. 115,000 jobs were created last month. 85% of those jobs were full-time jobs, Mr. Speaker. 60% of those jobs went to women. We saw in our March quarter national accounts economic growth of 1.8%, beating market expectations. We saw farm GDP have its strongest numbers in 7 years. We saw machinery and equipment with the strongest numbers in 17 years, and housing investment with the strongest number in 17, 18 years as well, Mr. Speaker, off the back of our programs. And indeed, if you take the last 3 quarters of economic growth, it's been the strongest in more than 50 years. And we saw Standard & Poor's say that Australia's response to this crisis has been swift and decisive, Mr. Speaker. And we saw them affirm our AAA credit rating, and Australia is one of only 9 countries in the world to have a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies. Well, I hear the interjections from the member for Rankin, Mr. Speaker, because he and the Labor Party promised at the last election higher taxes on families, whereas the coalition delivered lower taxes for families, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party at the last election promised higher taxes on businesses, and we have delivered lower taxes on businesses, Speaker. The Labor Party at the last election promised higher taxes on investment, and we have delivered lower taxes on investment, Mr. Speaker. And the Labor Party at the last election promised higher taxes on housing, Mr. Speaker, and we have delivered the programs and policies that have seen record numbers of first-home buyers get into the market, Mr. Speaker. And at the last election, the Labor Party promised higher taxes on superannuation, Mr. Speaker, and we have delivered policies which are cutting the fees for people with superannuation, Mr. Speaker. So we on this side of the House are cutting taxes and creating jobs in stark contrast to those opposite.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Leader of the House. This parliament has been used for 120 years to debate the issues of the day. If on the day, as new cases are coming out and borders are closing, the government won't accept a debate in the middle of a global pandemic, how bad does a crisis have to be before the government will allow this parliament to be used as a parliament?
The Leader of the House has the call. Members on my right.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've been in this parliament for a few years now, and I've seen a few debates, I've seen a few governments in action. I can remember very clearly, Mr. Speaker, when the Labor Party was sitting on this side of the House. We were denied day after day, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you what hasn't been accepted by those opposite. What hasn't been accepted by those opposite is that they lost the last election, Mr. Speaker. And by definition, Mr. Speaker, having lost the last election, they now sit on that side without the numbers in this chamber, so don't whinge about it. Don't whinge about it. It's a result of your own failings. You went to the last election promising taxes on every Australian, and you wonder why they voted you out. You went to the last election promising to restart boats and to surrender our sovereignty on borders. No wonder the Australian public rejected you. And I'll tell you, Mr Speaker, as we move around the country now and you speak to Australians from one corner of the country to the other, I'll tell you what Australians are saying, Mr Speaker. Thank God Bill Shorten's not the Prime Minister of this country. That's exactly what people are saying, Mr Speaker.
Will resume his seat for a second. Members on both sides. Members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The minister is misleading Parliament. People can't move around this country.
No, there's no point of order.
That's what we want to debate.
There's no point of order. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The member for Moreton is, and I call the Leader of the House. I'd ask him, I was about to intervene, I'd ask the Leader of the House to be relevant to the question. The question was a procedural one, and he was asked that in his capacity as the Leader of the House. It wasn't an opportunity for a wide-ranging critique or history lesson on elections past.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you for allowing the member for Moreton to stay here and to enjoy my contribution as well. Much greater punishment than if you were to send him out of the chamber, Mr Speaker, so I'm happy he's here. Mr Speaker, as we hear from the Australian public, to go to the very point raised in the question from the honourable member opposite, the Australian public has seen the government's response to COVID, and I'll tell you what, they look at what is happening around the world, and Australians are grateful that we are living in the country that we are today. We made a decision, Mr Speaker, in the National Security Committee of Cabinet over 12 months ago to lock our country down and to close our border with China. The greatest decision, Mr Speaker, we made during the period of COVID, because it stopped that virus coming to our country. Mr Speaker, at the same time, the Prime Minister has demonstrated the leadership to stand up and to be with the premiers to make decisions in relation to the health system that has saved this country tens of thousands of deaths, Mr Speaker. So do you think we're going to be lectured to by those opposite with their chief political...
Leader of the House could pause for a second. In the time remaining, if he wishes to continue his answer, he has to address himself to the procedural. You've concluded. The member for just the Leader of the Opposition, if you could, one, not interject, and two, not interject in that fashion when I'm about to call someone. It might give the wrong impression to people listening on radio. The member for INDI.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, on the 13th of December 2018, you promised Australia a robust Federal Integrity Commission. On September the 8th, it will be 1,000 days since you made that promise. It became your election promise. Australians are still waiting, Prime Minister. Will you commit to passing a robust bill before 1,000 days is up on September the 8th?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank you for the question to the member, and the Minister representing the Attorney-General will add, I imagine, to my answer. What I would note, Mr Speaker, is that the government has already moved to expand the jurisdiction of the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. From January of this year, ACLE was given jurisdiction over 4 additional agencies, the ATO, ASIC, APRA and the ACCC. In the 2021-22 budget, ACLE was funded a further $54.3 million over the forward estimates to support its expanded jurisdiction, and that includes $51.9 million in operating funding and $2.4 million in capital funding to establish an office in Melbourne. Draft legislation to establish the Commonwealth Integrity Commission was released for public consultation on the 2nd of November of last year, and submissions closed on the 12th of February of this year. That consultation is critical to this process. After the government has considered feedback on that draft legislation, we will look to finalise the model and determine likely support, Mr Speaker, before introducing legislation into the Parliament. The Minister representing the Attorney-General may wish to add further, but if he believes that covers the matter, then that would be my response, Mr Speaker.
The Minister representing the Attorney-General.
Very good, Minister.
Members on my left.
Very good. I do believe that the Prime Minister's excellent answer covers the matter.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the minister please update the House on how the government is helping to keep Australians safe from COVID-19?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Wentworth, particularly for his work in encouraging the people in his electorate and across New South Wales to be vaccinated. During the course of today, we expect that the 2 millionth person in New South Wales will have been vaccinated, and in terms of the work, already the New South Wales government has vaccinated 710,000 people across the state, and the Commonwealth Government, in partnership with the GPs and our work through aged and disability, has vaccinated over 1.25 million people. Around the world, though, we know that the pandemic continues to rage. In the last 24 hours, there were over 400,000 cases officially reported worldwide. There were over 9,600 lives lost, and that means that this year there has been approximately 2,080,000 lives officially lost to COVID-19. In Australia, we remain in the almost unimaginable position of having lost no person this year to having caught COVID and passed from COVID in this nation. In terms of keeping Australians safe, there could not be a stronger test. But I am very pleased to be able to inform the House that shortly before question time, the National Incident Centre informed me that the last remaining person in ICU with COVID has left ICU, that there is no Australian at this moment with COVID in any ICU anywhere in Australia. Any case, however, of course, could be fatal. That's why this is such an ongoing national challenge in the face of a global pandemic. And that's why all of the things that we have done together as a nation from the beginning, as the Leader of the House said, in relation to the closure of the borders, to the testing, the tracing, the distancing and the vaccinations, work together and have worked together to protect this nation on a scale and in a way that across the world is almost unparalleled. As we speak, at this point, as the Prime Minister mentioned, in the last 24 hours, 140,800 vaccinations, over 6.86 million vaccinations that have occurred in Australia, and critically, that means 49% of those that are over 50 years of age have been vaccinated. Over 66% of those over 70 years of age have been vaccinated, and 100% of aged care facilities around the country have had first doses, and 99% approximately of aged care facilities around the country have had second doses. These are the things that are keeping Australia safe. It's a global pandemic with catastrophic results outside of our borders. It's a challenge inside our borders, but we have kept Australians safe and we will continue to do that.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. National Party amendments before the Senate right now block the additional 450 billion litres allocated for the health of the Murray-Darling Basin. After only a day in the job, why is the Deputy Prime Minister's first priority attacking the health of the rivers and the regional communities that depend on them by shredding the Murray-Darling Basin plan?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question and note the process that was facilitated to bring about the Murray-Darling Basin plan. At the time, myself and the Minister, member for Watson, we had a choice between working together or the Labor Party working with the Greens, which would have brought a disastrous outcome for people on the river. Now, what we also note is that that was a section on the 450 whilst I was the Minister. I worked with that proposition, but I understand completely the concerns that are held. And I was only recently talking to the member for Nichols and the issues that are so important to those towns that we show also them security. There is an issue here that people are worried about the security of the river, but they're also worried about the security of their jobs. And jobs are so vitally important if we are to show these people that we care for them in the regional towns. And it's not just farmers, Mr Speaker. It is the hairdressers, it's the tyre shops, it's the grocery shops, it's all the people who live in the member for Mallee's seat. It's the people who live in the member for Nichols' seat. It's the people who live in the member for Farr's seat. It's the people who live in the Riverina, the member for Riverina's seat. We have an obligation to these people as well to make sure that they are not forgotten in Canberra. And what I see from our colleagues in the Senate is they are making sure that these people know that the Nationals are hearing them and are making sure that they are doing their very best,
Members
to
on my
show
left.
that their jobs in these regional towns are just as important as the jobs in Adelaide, are just as important as the jobs in Sydney, because it's these people who've gone out to the Mildura's, who've gone out to Wagga, who've gone out to Griffith, who've gone into these places where other people won't go. These are the people putting product on the boat, and feeding our nation in such a way as that we can have the standard of living that we have here today. And although we mightn't see them, we respect absolutely the job they do. So if you're asking me why are the Nationals in the Senate making sure that these people understand that we hear them and respect their views, that is because that is what the Nationals' job is.
The member for Reid.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is focused on technology, not taxes, to reduce emissions? And is the minister aware of any approaches standing in the way of this? Thank you.
The Minister for Energy and Emission Reduction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Reid for her question. And she knows, as we all do on this side of the House, that the way to reduce emissions is through technology, not taxation, through innovation, not elimination, Mr Speaker. That's our focus. Now, that's why we're investing in our technology investment roadmap, $20 billion, driving $80 billion of overall investment, 160,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. We're positioning Australia for success by investing in low-emissions technologies that will protect our industries, grow those industries indeed, while creating new ones, Mr Speaker, and we need our best and brightest minds working on that, Mr Speaker, in organisations like ARENA, Mr Speaker, like ARENA. Now, that's why we are absolutely committed to expanding ARENA's mandate to support investment in the full range of technologies that will reduce emissions right across every sector in the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. We shouldn't be restricting ARENA, we should be enabling it and expanding it, Mr Speaker. Now, I am asked what is standing in the way, Mr Speaker, and I'm looking at it, Mr Speaker. I'm looking at it. Last night, Labor cheered and clapped and patted themselves on the back by voting against jobs, Mr Speaker, by voting against jobs. They stood in the way of $192 million of investment in low emissions technologies, Mr Speaker, in technologies like carbon capture and storage, investments like in healthy soils, Mr Speaker, in hydrogen, indeed in electric charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, Mr Speaker. Now, they worse than that, voted against programs that would create 1,400 jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, ARENA welcomed the changes. They welcomed the changes. They said it was a new era for ARENA. But I tell you who didn't welcome it, Mr Speaker, the member for Hunter. He called it ideological craziness, Mr Speaker, as we've already heard. Ideological craziness, he said on 2GB this morning, Mr Speaker. But this is what the Labor Party has become. This is what they have become, cozying up to their coalition partners, the Greens, Mr Speaker. That's not our approach, because every day we support agriculture in this place, Mr Speaker. We support heavy industry. We support the transport sector, the resources sector, Mr Speaker. And we know when it comes to reducing emissions, it's about technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker. But the member for McMahon, the Shadow Minister, Mr Speaker, he's never seen a tax he didn't like.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Is the government planning any policy changes to increase female workforce participation in regional Australia? Or does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with one of his government colleagues who says women using childcare, and I quote, are outsourcing parenting?
Just before I call the Deputy Prime Minister, just before I call him, I mean, I've had to address these matters before. Ministers can't be asked about statements of other members of the House. It's clear in the practice. The first part of the question, though, is completely in order. Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Look, I do support childcare. I absolutely support childcare. In fact, I'm one of the beneficiaries of childcare, and I live in a regional area. It is important that either parent that takes on a primary caring role, and at times it's the case that both have to go out to make the payments, to pay for the house, to pay for the car, and this is a vital componentry of how our society works. And we're lucky we can do it, Mr. Speaker, because we have to have these changes that are actually improving it are brought in by this side of the parliament. It's this side of the parliament that has understood that concept, and it's this side of the parliament that is championing that concept, and it's this side of the parliament that those, whether they're mothers at home or fathers at home, had to wait until we were on the Treasury benches for these issues to be dealt with. Now, I might ask the Minister, if she wishes, to add to my comments.
Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. On this side of the House, we firmly believe in choice. It is choice for families. If they want to use the childcare system, they can, and choice for families if they want to have a stay-at-home parent, they can. In some instances, Mr. Speaker, the parents don't have that choice because both parents need to go into the workforce, and in that instance, then we need to provide affordable, quality childcare. And that's exactly what this government's been doing. We've increased childcare subsidies by 77% since we came to office. And in the most recent budget, Mr. Speaker, we added an additional $1.7 billion of subsidy, particularly targeted at those families with 2 or more children in childcare. Why is that? Because that's where the costs really start to add up. If you've got 2 or more children in childcare, Mr. Speaker, it's a targeted approach. It'll help 250,000 families across the country. My question to those opposite who are interjecting and shouting out—
the Minister, you don't get to ask questions, you only get to answer them.
Mr. Speaker, and I put this to the opposition. Will you back our legislation which will be introducing—
The Minister—
I'll restate this, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow we'll be introducing the legislation to enact these additional new changes, which will benefit 250,000 families. And I will be looking for the support from those opposite for this bill. Declare where you will stand, because 250,000 families rely on the support of this bill to get through this parliament.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister update the House on the strength of the resource sector and the plan the Morrison government is implementing to streamline and cut red and green tape, creating jobs and supporting regional communities? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Resources. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for Herbert? The honourable member turned out for Queensland this morning, Mr. Speaker, in State of Origin, but he always turns out for his electorate and the people he represents. And the member for Herbert understands what it is the resources sector does for our economy and for jobs. Now, Mr. Speaker, we expect this financial year, that the resources sector for exports for resources and energy could actually break all Australian records and go through $300 billion by the end of the financial year. In the midst of a COVID outbreak, a worldwide pandemic, they are helping to hold together our economy and deliver jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, we want the resources sector to do more. That's why we are looking to cut red and green tape. That's why we have legislation before the House looking to streamline approval processes, looking for one-touch options, and we are working with state and territory governments to make that a reality. Because what does it mean for Australia? It means that projects can get an approval. Why should they have to have two layers of what is effectively the same level of approval? Why should they have those costs, those delays, when we can have those jobs and that investment in Australia right now, earlier than before? But, Mr Speaker, there are those that have a different view. And, Mr Speaker, we have support, and I note an editorial from the West Australian, Mr Speaker. And now there is a screaming headline here, Mr Speaker, a screaming headline. It says that someone's WA credentials are on the line. Now, I know you're interested, Mr Speaker, on who that might be. He might be just over here. He's pretty close to us, Mr Speaker. He's not far away. But it literally says Albanese's WA credentials are on the line. Now, why is that? It's because Premier McGowan supports our position. They support what we are trying to do in Western Australia, the big resource state, where there's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of investment, it relies on these things. Now, Mr Speaker, Premier Mark McGowan and Prime Minister Scott Morrison working together, but so far they've left federal Labor opposition leader Anthony Albanese on the outer. And Mr McGowan said on Monday his government has been calling for the proposed changes for 18 months. So I say to those opposite, Mr Speaker, there is the time to step up, and that time is now. We need this investment. We need this investment in Australia, Mr Speaker. And I go on, Mr Speaker, the editorial, it says that he needs to ensure his party backs the changes. And I'd say to those opposite, this is critical to what we are trying to do. We want more investment in Australia. We want processes to ensure that investment comes here, that drives jobs into our country, Mr Speaker. And what we know is there's a lot of others who are on board. I mean, even in Victoria, Mr Speaker, we put out what was known as the acreage release, offshore oil and gas exploration, supported by the Victorian government. We have the Shadow Minister saying that she supports the resources sector, supports gas exploration, and yet I have a letter from the member for Corangamite saying, Mr Speaker, that it's very straightforward. I encourage you to rethink the decision, not enable oil and gas exploration. So do you support the sector or not, Mr Speaker? Are you with those hard-working men and women or not? Clearly those opposite are not.
Concluded. The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. This week, Steph Ryan, the Deputy Leader of the Nationals in Victoria, has said, "I've never made any secret of the fact that I think Barnaby Joyce's previous actions didn't really make him eligible for the top job." Why do so many regional Australian women who know the Deputy Prime Minister say he's unfit for the job?
I don't believe that question is in order. It doesn't go to his ministerial responsibilities. I made those rulings yesterday. I won't detain the House. If the member for Ballarat wishes to read those for further information, she can, and I call the member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment. Will the minister update the House on the world-leading approach that the Morrison government is taking with the management of our Great Barrier Reef?
The Minister for the Environment.
The political trinket too.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it's great to take a question from the fabulous reef envoy, the member for Leichhardt, and I am so glad to hear that he's going around again, that he's coming back into this parliament, and I know it wouldn't be the same place without him. He fights tirelessly for his constituents of Leichhardt and indeed for the reef. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is deeply committed to protecting the vast and magnificent Great Barrier Reef. The centrepiece of our reef protection efforts is the Reef 2050 plan, jointly developed with the Queensland Government. And the focus of this plan is about supporting the reef's health and building its resilience in the face of climate change. The Australian and Queensland governments between them are investing more than $3 billion in the Reef 2050 plan. Now, those are big numbers, but what they mean on the ground is practical and effective. It means we can continue the conservation work with sea turtles at MONCRIEFF and Rain Island, changing the temperature of the sand to get a better balance of male turtles. It means we've got 5 vessels out on the water spearing crown-of-thorns starfish, intervening to protect our precious marine ecosystems. It means that we have world-leading science under our Reef Restoration and Adaptation program that looks at building heat resistance in corals. And our practical action on emissions reduction goes hand in hand with our practical action on reef protection and climate adaptation. We are leading the way. Mr Speaker, on the reef, I have noted this week we will strongly oppose a draft World Heritage Committee recommendation that the Great Barrier Reef be singled out for in danger listing, because every reef is under pressure from climate change and no reef is better managed than the Great Barrier Reef. So for the UNESCO draft decision to single out Australia is unreasonable, a subversion of process, and we will fight it. We will fight it for the communities who live along the reef. The proposed listing fails to recognise the enormous efforts of traditional owners, farmers, tourism operators and communities up and down the reef catchment. My message today is that the Morrison government stands with you. I'm not sure about the Labor Party, where they are on Team Australia with the commitment that we need to demonstrate internationally about how we manage the reef. Now, the jeering and sneering, Mr Speaker, is of course about climate change questions, and the Labor Party should know that they are correctly dealt with in a different convention. What the World Heritage Convention says is how you manage your World Heritage-listed properties, and no one can argue that that gold standard of management is absolutely the approach that Australia has to the Great Barrier Reef. And I expect every member of this place to support our effort to reverse this decision and to bring our reef into the international community.
Concluded. The member for Brand.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Regional Development, and I refer to his answer yesterday about comments by the Western Australian Nationals leader about his ability to work with the women of regional Australia. How can the Deputy Prime Minister do his job as Regional Development Minister when so many regional women who know him well object to him holding high office?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question, and I suppose I return to my answers of yesterday, that I acknowledge that in a whole range of areas there are people who may dislike me, and there are people who like me. That's part of politics. There are not only, I'm sure there are blokes who dislike me as well, and that is part of life. But if on reflection of as we go through life, we always try to learn from our mistakes and become a better person.
The member for Ballarat.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is working to ensure the proposed Australian curriculum will achieve a higher overall standard of educational achievement in Australia, uphold Australian values and encourage greater engagement in civic life?
The Minister for Education.
Thank Mr Barrera for his question. And Mr Speaker, we live in the greatest country in the world. We are one of the wealthiest, the most free, the safest and the most egalitarian countries on earth, and we offer unlimited opportunities for those people who want to work hard and get ahead. And Mr Speaker, we are so attractive as a nation that millions of people across the world have immigrated to this country to come to our shores and make this nation, Australia, their home. But Mr Speaker, you would not think that this is such a great country if you were reading the draft history curriculum, which is out for consultation as part of the review of the national curriculum today. In fact, when you read the full 84 pages of the draft history curriculum, there's not many great things said about our country at all. In fact, even Anzac Day itself is presented as a contested idea. If you read through the full 1,700 pages of the draft curriculum, you wouldn't necessarily come out with a deep understanding of why we are this fantastic liberal democracy that we are today, Mr Speaker. We have to do better than this. The national curriculum, Mr Speaker, it goes to the heart of what children are taught. Not just the content, but the values which are embedded in that, and also the standards which come about from this as well. And Mr Speaker, we shouldn't have a negative view of our history. We absolutely have had tough times in the past, which we need to reconcile ourselves with. But students should learn about that. But fundamentally, students should come out of school with the love of this nation and what we have achieved together. They should understand our deep Indigenous history, Mr Speaker. They should understand our deep British foundations, which set the scene for our great democracy, built on Judeo-Christian values. And they should understand our fantastic multicultural character, which has come about in previous decades because waves of immigration arriving here. And equally, Mr Speaker, the curriculum needs to lift our overall education standards for this country, because over the last 20 years, sadly, our education standards has declined. A 15-year-old today, Mr Speaker, is 12 months behind where a 15-year-old was 20 years ago. The curriculum sets that benchmark of standards, and we want to see those standards lift, Mr Speaker. There's been some positive improvements overall in the draft national curriculum, but we have to do better, Mr Speaker, and that's what we're going to be looking for as I work with the states and territories to see that achieved. And I hope that those opposite will equally share this vision that we have for this national curriculum, for higher standards to be set, for a love of country to be embedded in the history and the civics, and for people to come out wanting to participate in our great
time
national
has
civic
concluded.
life.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Transport. The New South Wales Government has committed to substantial subsidies for electric vehicles. Does the Transport Minister believe this will kill the weekend?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I have great pleasure in taking this question. Quite obviously, if we were going to help electric cars, we would have supported the arena legislation. We would have supported the arena legislation. But of course, the Labor Party last night did not support it. And there's a reason for that, and I'd like to quote the honourable member for Grainler and the honourable member for Hunter, because this goes to the reasoning about how we finance electric cars. The member for Grainler said, and we don't think that carbon capture and storage should come at the expense of using existing renewable energy frameworks such as the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. But the member for Hunter said, and it's regrettable that Labor is now opposing $1.2 billion worth of public investment that could go to things such as electric cars in carbon-reducing innovation simply because we don't like the entities being used to spend the additional money. And then he said, and this is the clincher, now that is ideological craziness. So I think for the member for McMahon, should be asking the member for Grainler about his ideological craziness. Because the member for McMahon himself said the Senate just voted.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, on relevance.
I thought that would be the point of order. Well, I think I can rule on it.
The minister gave a quote about the Clean Energy Finance Corporation.
You can resume your seat. Well, look, the difficulty is with the question. I mean, the question was a short question. It was a succinct question, but the problem with it is, I mean, it's unanswerable when the question is, do you believe this will kill the weekend? I mean, it's not a. Look, and you've just made my point. It's not a question. It's a political statement. So I'm not going to insist on a yes/no answer. I will say to the Deputy Prime Minister, there wasn't any question about alternatives, and he just needs to confine himself now to the policy matter that was in the question. But that's why I allowed some latitude. If you want me to strictly enforce the rules on questions, happy to start, but I don't think you'd be very happy with it.
Well,
the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. So I go to the point of what will kill the weekend,
And what will kill the weekend for the member for Grayndler most of the times is the member for Hunter. It kills the weekend for him. It actually destroys the weekend for him. I think what hurts the weekend, what kills the weekend for many people on the other side is that they're on the other side. That's what hurts them on the weekend. I think what other issues might hurt them, might kill the weekend for them. Well, of course, a whole bevy of reasons of frustrations that have built up over such a long period of time because they have the long-term, the man who's about to go on long service leave for good as their leader. They're going to be there forever.
I just say the Deputy Prime Minister, you've
weekend.
concluded your answer. I think we've agreed on that at the same time. At precisely the same time. The member for Mallee has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health, Regional Communications and Local Government. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is improving the lives of regional Australians?
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Mallee for the question. There's no doubt that there's no better place to live in the world at the moment is regional Australia. The people in regional Australia, whether they work in the health sector, whether they work in local government, whether they're delivering services right across the country, are doing a great job in keeping us safe. But this government recognises the importance that we have the facilities, the services and the personnel to continue that growth. And I'm very proud to say that this government, with the Stronger Rural Health Strategy, have seen in the last 2 years an extra 700 doctors and an extra 700 nurses delivered across regional Australia. We've seen through the John Flynn vocational training scheme doubling the number of training places for junior doctors so that they get that experience in those regional areas. We can see through the Murray-Darling Medical School where we've got country people training in country areas to be able to deliver services to country towns, oversubscribed with people wanting to be part of that. And so this week, Mr Speaker, is the Australian Local Government Conference, and councils from right around Australia are here discussing their issues. And I'm pleased to say that during the pandemic we have partnered with local government through the local roads and stronger community infrastructure, and those people in those 537 councils all around Australia have been providing stimulus in partnership with this government to make sure that those small towns and villages and regional centres right across the country have been kept out of the pandemic, have been made in a stronger position so that they can continue to be the economic powerhouse of this country. Telecommunications is incredibly important. I'm pleased to say that this government has funded 1,200 towers under the Black Spot program, over 950 of those up and running. But what I'm really excited about is the regional connectivity program where, along with the major telecommunications companies, start-up companies, smaller innovative companies are delivering bespoke levels of data, understanding that regional Australia has the capacity to grow because of the connectivity. They are innovators, they are inventors, and they lead the world in innovation, whether it's in agriculture, mining, and now what we're seeing with the pandemic, we are seeing that people are working remotely. They're keeping jobs in the city but living in the country. Mr Speaker, regional Australia is the best place to be, and this government is making sure that it will have a secure future.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Okay.